Eleanor Powell's house in San Francisco still stands, a stately structure nestled in a quiet, aging neighborhood. But there's a reason few people are eager to step inside. The house, with its faded elegance and creaky floorboards, is a place where the past doesn't stay buried. It's a place that seems to remember, and it's a place where Eleanor Powell, the legendary dancer and actress, never truly left. It started when the Thompson family moved in. They had heard the rumors, of course the stories that circulated about the house, about the strange occurrences, the eerie presence. But they chalked it up to neighborhood gossip. That is, until their first night. The wind howled through the narrow streets, and the rain tapped relentlessly against the windows. But inside, the house was unnervingly still. It wasn't until the clock struck midnight that they heard it, the sound of tapping heels, sharp and deliberate, echoing from the living room below. Jack Thompson, initially dismissing it as the house settling, crept downstairs. What he saw nearly made his heart stop. There, in the dim light, stood a figure, a woman, dressed in an old-fashioned gown, her back to him. The faintest sound of music played, though no record player or radio was on. It was Eleanor Powell, or rather what was left of her, dancing in silence, her movements fluid and graceful. But there was something unsettling in the way she moved, as if the air around her thickened with a palpable unease. She twirled, spun, then stopped abruptly, her head jerking toward Jack with a piercing gaze. Frozen, he couldn't look away. Her eyes, though vacant, seemed to hold a depth of sorrow, regret, even. She blinked once, slowly, before fading into the darkness, leaving only the faint smell of perfume and the echo of her final, haunting step. The next day, Jack tried to explain it to his wife, Linda. She was skeptical, of course. No one believed in ghosts. But when she stepped into the living room later that afternoon, the atmosphere was different, heavy, oppressive. The floorboards creaked underfoot, but it wasn't the house settling. It was something else, something watching. Later that evening, as the family gathered for dinner, Linda noticed something chilling. A set of footprints appeared on the hardwood floor, leading toward the grand piano in the corner. No one had been there. The house was empty for hours before they returned. And yet the prints, perfectly shaped, with tiny heel impressions, continued across the room. The piano keys were pressed down, the notes still faintly echoing as if played by unseen hands. But it didn't end there. Over the following weeks, strange occurrences escalated. Neighbors spoke of hearing the sound of tapping heels at odd hours, sometimes even in the middle of the night. And one morning, a local delivery driver swore he saw a shadow through the upstairs window. A shadow that seemed to dance from room to room. When he returned with the package hours later, the door was locked, and there was no sign of anyone inside. Eleanor Powell's ghost, they say, dances not because she wants to entertain, but because she's trapped. Trapped in a house she can never leave, reliving a life that was never truly hers. The Thompson family eventually left, unable to endure the nightly visits. They packed their bags and fled, leaving the house empty once again. But the dancing never stopped. People still hear the tapping of her heels, echoing through the empty rooms. And to this day, some say if you stand in the living room long enough, you can feel the chill of her presence, hear the soft shuffle of her steps as she continues her lonely dance, forever caught in the house she once called home. The Thompsons left, abandoning their dream home to the whispers of the past. But the house refused to stay quiet for long. Within weeks, a new owner appeared, a historian named Rachel Myers, who saw the property as a treasure trove of untold stories. She wasn't one to scare easily, and the rumors about Eleanor Powell's ghost only deepened her curiosity. Rachel moved in with notebooks and recording equipment, determined to document what she believed were exaggerated local legends. She told herself she'd approach it rationally, scientifically. But the moment she crossed the threshold, something felt off. The air inside the house was colder than the blustery San Francisco evening. And then there was the smell, a faint trace of powder and lavender, as if someone had just left the room. That first night, Rachel decided to sleep in the living room, setting up cameras and audio devices around her. She wanted to capture the infamous ghost dancer in action. Hours passed, the house silent except for the occasional groan of its old wooden frame. Midnight came and went without incident. Rachel began to relax, telling herself the stories were likely just that, stories. But then, at 3:15 a.m., the sound began. Tap, tap, tap. It was faint at first, like a metronome ticking somewhere far away. Rachel sat up, her heart hammering. The sound grew louder, sharper, echoing down the hallway toward the living room. Tap, tap, tap. Her camera's red recording light blinked steadily in the dimness. She reached for her flashlight, its beam cutting through the shadows. "Hello," she called out, her voice trembling despite her effort to sound composed. The tapping stopped. For a moment, there was nothing but silence. Then, without warning, the grand piano let out a single, discordant note. Rachel jumped, nearly dropping the flashlight. Her gaze darted to the piano, its glossy surface reflecting the faint moonlight streaming through the curtains. The keys were still unmoving. She stepped closer, the flashlight shaking in her hand. And then she saw it. A handprint. A perfect, powdery handprint on the lid of the piano, as if someone had just closed it moments before. Her breath hitched. She spun around, shining the flashlight toward the living room, but it revealed only the empty chairs and the gleam of her equipment. The faint sound of a woman humming drifted through the air. It was a soft melody, sweet yet haunting, and it seemed to come from everywhere and nowhere all at once. Rachel followed the sound, her feet carrying her to the base of the staircase. The melody grew louder. The sound was coming from upstairs. Rachel hesitated. Every rational part of her screamed to turn back, to leave the house and never return. But she couldn't. She had to know. Slowly, she climbed the stairs, each step creaking beneath her weight. The hallway at the top was dark, the air colder still. The melody led her to a door at the far end, the master bedroom. She pushed it open. The room was empty, except for the faint outline of moonlight spilling across the floor. The sound stopped, but something else caught her attention. On the floorboards, faint but unmistakable, were footprints. Tiny, delicate footprints leading from the doorway to the center of the room. They ended in a circle, as if someone had been spinning in place. Rachel knelt to examine them, her fingers tracing the faint impressions. As she did, the air grew heavy, and a new sound filled the room. Not music, but a low, rhythmic whisper, like words spoken just out of earshot. Suddenly, a gust of wind blew through the room, slamming the door shut behind her. Rachel scrambled to her feet, the flashlight flickering wildly. The whispering grew louder, clearer, as if it was coming from the walls themselves. "She's waiting," the voice said, clear and cold. "She's always waiting." The floor beneath Rachel's feet trembled as if someone or something was dancing just beneath the surface. Then, as abruptly as it started, everything went still. Silent. Rachel turned toward the door, her pulse racing, only to see a shadow pass across it, a figure moving outside the room. The faint smell of lavender returned, stronger this time, almost suffocating. And then the voice came again, this time from directly behind her. "Shall we dance? Don't forget to subscribe and like if you liked this story." Rachel froze, every hair on her body standing on end. She didn't dare turn around. The voice was soft, lilting, yet filled with an unnatural weight. The air behind her felt charged, like a storm ready to break. She wanted to scream, to run, but her feet refused to move. Her mind spun in frantic circles, trying to rationalize the impossible. "This isn't real," she whispered to herself. "It can't be real." But then, the voice came again, closer this time, brushing against her ear like a chilling breeze. "Shall we dance?" Rachel turned, the motion slow and mechanical, as if her body moved against her will. The flashlight flickered weakly, illuminating a figure in the middle of the room. It was her. Eleanor Powell, radiant and terrifying all at once. Her gown shimmered faintly in the pale moonlight, but her face was wrong blurred, as though it couldn't fully manifest. And yet her eyes were sharp, piercing, locked onto Rachel with a knowing intensity. Eleanor raised a hand, beckoning. her movements graceful and deliberate. Rachel's heart pounded so loudly she thought it might burst. I don't, she stammered, her voice breaking, but Eleanor's head tilted, her smile growing too wide, stretching into something unnatural. Her feet began to move, a slow, deliberate tap-tap-tap against the floor. The rhythm filled the room, growing louder, echoing through the house. Rachel stumbled back, colliding with the dresser behind her. The flashlight tumbled from her grasp, spinning wildly before coming to rest, its beam casting long, shifting shadows that seemed to dance with Eleanor. The music was back now, faint and warped, as if it were playing from a decayed record. And then Rachel felt a pressure around her wrist. She looked down, her breath catching in her throat. Nothing was there, yet she could feel it, something cold, unyielding, pulling her forward, toward Eleanor. No, Rachel whimpered, trying to pull back. But the invisible grip was relentless, dragging her into the circle of footprints in the center of the room. Her feet stumbled, then found themselves moving in rhythm, unwilling participants in the ghostly dance. "Stop!" she shouted, her voice trembling with desperation. But Eleanor only laughed, the sound hollow and echoing as if it came from a great distance. The room seemed to spin, the walls blurring, the air growing thicker with every passing moment. Rachel's body betrayed her, her feet twisting and turning in perfect synchronicity with Eleanor's. Then, as the tempo of the dance quickened, Rachel noticed something horrifying. The room was changing. The wallpaper, once faded and peeling, now gleamed with a vibrant, Art Deco pattern. The furniture, dusty and covered in sheets just hours ago, stood polished and pristine. A chandelier above her blazed with light, casting dazzling reflections across the room. And the figures, they appeared all at once, men and women in elegant 1930s attire, their faces pale and expressionless, standing along the edges of the room. They clapped and cheered, but their mouths never moved. Their eyes, dark and empty, remained fixed on Rachel. She stumbled, breaking the rhythm for a moment. Eleanor stopped abruptly, her head snapping toward Rachel with a sharp, inhuman motion. The applause ceased, the room falling deathly silent. The crowd of figures turned as one, their hollow gazes boring into Rachel. "You can't stop now," Eleanor said, her voice dripping with menace. "We haven't finished." Rachel's knees buckled, and she fell to the floor, gasping for air. The music warped again, the notes twisting into an agonizing cacophony. The figures around her began to move, their limbs jerking unnaturally as they approached, encircling her. "Please," Rachel begged, tears streaming down her face. But Eleanor only smiled, her blurred face twisting into something monstrous. "You came here to see me," she said, her voice echoing with 1,000 whispers. "And now you'll stay, just like the others." The walls began to close in, the figures leaning closer, their pale hands reaching out. The scent of lavender grew overpowering, suffocating. Rachel's vision blurred, her screams swallowed by the unrelenting shadows. And somewhere, far off, the sound of tapping heels continued. Rachel's screams died in her throat as the world around her seemed to collapse into itself. The figures, those hollow-eyed spectators, melted into the walls like shadows retreating into darkness. The once vibrant room faded, the chandelier's glow snuffing out in an instant. She was alone again, or so she thought. The silence was deafening. Rachel lay sprawled on the floor, her chest heaving, her limbs trembling. She dared not move, dared not breathe too loudly, as if the house itself might notice her. Then, faintly, she heard it, a low, rhythmic humming. It wasn't Eleanor's voice this time. No, this was deeper, heavier, almost guttural. And it was coming from beneath her. Rachel scrambled to her feet, her flashlight long gone. She fumbled for her phone in her pocket, its dim glow barely illuminating the warped floorboards. The humming grew louder, resonating through the wood like the pulse of something alive. She knelt, hesitating before pressing her ear to the ground. What she heard made her blood run cold. It wasn't just humming. It was voices, dozens of them, maybe more. They whispered and murmured in a chaotic symphony, words overlapping, some too faint to discern, others unnervingly clear. Join us. Don't leave. She never stops. She never lets go. Rachel shot upright, her heart hammering. The whispers seemed to follow her now, rising in intensity, surrounding her. The walls groaned, the floor beneath her feet trembling as if the house was alive, breathing, watching. She stumbled backward, colliding with the door. Her hand fumbled for the knob, but it wouldn't budge. It was as if the door had fused to the frame, trapping her inside. "Let me out!" she shouted, pounding on the door. But the only response was the tapping. That infernal tapping. It echoed from the hallway now, sharp and deliberate, growing closer with each passing second. Rachel pressed her back against the door, her eyes darting wildly around the room. The tapping stopped just outside, replaced by a low creak as if someone or something was leaning against the other side. Then, slowly, the doorknob began to turn. "No," Rachel whispered, shaking her head. "No, no, no." The door burst open, and Rachel fell backward into darkness. She hit the ground hard, the wind knocked from her lungs. Gasping, she scrambled to her knees, her phone's light flickering. But she wasn't in the bedroom anymore. She was in a ballroom. It stretched endlessly in all directions, the polished floor gleaming like black glass. The ceiling soared high above her, lost in shadows, and faint, ghostly chandeliers floated in the air, their light cold and unnatural. Music drifted through the space, a haunting waltz that seemed to echo from nowhere and everywhere at once. And then she saw them, the dancers. They emerged from the shadows, their forms translucent, their faces obscured by flickering veils. They moved in perfect unison, their steps light and deliberate, yet their movements felt wrong, jerky, unnatural. Rachel's breath caught as she realized their feet never touched the floor. At the center of the room stood Eleanor. Her form was more defined now, her face sharper, almost human. She smiled at Rachel, a smile that didn't reach her cold, dead eyes. She extended a hand, her gloved fingers impossibly long and thin. "Come," Eleanor said, her voice echoing across the ballroom. "The dance is just beginning." Rachel shook her head, backing away, but the dancers were closing in, their movements synchronizing with the waltz. The music grew louder, faster, as if urging her to join. She turned to run, but the ballroom stretched endlessly in every direction. There was nowhere to go. And then she felt it again, that icy grip around her wrist. She whipped around, expecting to see Eleanor, but there was nothing there. Only the grip tightening, pulling her back toward the center of the ballroom. She screamed, clawing at her arm, but it was useless. The dancers began to laugh, a hollow, bone-chilling sound that reverberated through the endless space. Rachel's feet slid across the floor as the invisible force dragged her closer to Eleanor, who stood motionless, her smile widening, her eyes gleaming with something ancient and hungry. "Once you dance," Eleanor said, her voice low and dripping with malice, "you'll never leave." Rachel's body betrayed her. Her legs moved against her will, her feet twisting into the first steps of the waltz. Eleanor took her hand, her grip like ice, and pulled her into the dance. The music surged, the room spinning faster and faster until the world blurred into darkness. Somewhere in the void, Rachel's phone lay discarded, its screen still recording. And deep within the audio file, beneath the static and Rachel's distant screams, the faint sound of tapping heels echoed endlessly. The waltz became a whirlwind, pulling Rachel into its relentless rhythm. Her body moved in perfect time with Eleanor's, but her mind screamed, trapped in a prison of terror. The dancers around her blurred, their laughter morphing into shrill cries. The ballroom itself seemed to crumble, the darkness closing in like a suffocating shroud. And then, with a deafening silence, everything stopped. Rachel stood frozen in the center of the empty ballroom. The dancers were gone. The music had vanished. But she wasn't alone. Eleanor loomed before her, her face no longer blurred but horrifyingly clear. Her hollow eyes locked with Rachel's as she leaned in, her voice a whisper that seemed to echo through eternity. "You're home now." The world around Rachel dissolved, and when she awoke, she was no longer herself. She moved like a marionette, her feet tapping endlessly across the dusty floors of the abandoned house. Her cries for help went unheard, lost in the rhythm of an eternal dance. Weeks later, a local paranormal investigator stumbled upon Rachel's phone, still lying in the corner of the room. The recording was intact. In the final moments of the footage, the faint outline of a new dancer could be seen in the shadows, forever spinning, forever trapped. Don't forget to subscribe and like if you liked this story. Any coincidences with real events or characters are accidental.